Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hi, I'm Tricia Class. Today I'm talking with Dr. Sherry Sanden, faculty in the School of Teaching and Learning, where she teaches in the Early Childhood Education program. The article we will discuss today examines the independent reading, understanding, and practices of effective teachers. Welcome, Sherry. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Tricia.
You mentioned in your article that you wanted to examine independent reading practices in schools due in part to a national reading panel's finding that they did not find a significant effect of this practice, while other studies noticed that there were positive impacts. Could you explain the discrepancies you noted?
Just to be clear, the National Reading Panel didn't propose that independent reading in school was unimportant or ineffective, but merely that there wasn't conclusive research allowing decisions to be made regarding its use as a classroom practice. However, as you mentioned, other studies have reported the positive influence of increased reading on reading ability. I think this discrepancy may be explained in large part by the methodology employed by the National Reading Panel. Their assessment of the research literature was limited to experimental and quasi-experimental studies, which are often difficult to conduct in education settings and therefore difficult to find. In fact, they found only 14 studies that met their very specific selection criteria. So many of the studies that you took note of did find a positive relationship, however they were left out. And then most of those studies that were conducted by the National Reading Panel and included in the National Reading Panel's report were investigations of sustained silent reading and similarly labeled programs. Sustained silent reading is a specific type of independent reading. Typical requirements include students being provided with regularly scheduled amounts of time each day to read any material that they choose, with few follow-up requirements. Frequently in SSR, adults modeling reading behaviors participate with students in reading alongside them rather than conducting any sort of support or instruction. And true SSR doesn't include any accountability measures in an attempt to simply immerse students in enjoyable reading. As my findings demonstrated, SSR may not reflect the kind of independent reading that occurs in most classrooms. This may help explain why the National Reading Panel results differed from a number of other studies regarding the influence of reading practice on reading ability.
Thank you. You really want to examine highly effective teachers. Can you summarize your in-depth methods for identifying the effective teachers, and then how you collected information about their understandings in classroom practices?
Well, in my attempt to better understand the ways that teachers think about and utilize independent reading in their classrooms, I placed great importance on observing teachers' actions and hearing from the teachers themselves. Consistent with the views of a number of other researchers, I believe in the vast possibilities for increasing our professional knowledge by examining the processes of expertise in action in the form of practices of highly effective classroom teachers. So the participants in this study consisted of 8 in-service elementary classroom teachers. I asked 99 elementary school principals to nominate teachers whom they considered highly effective teachers of literacy, but these nominations were a starting point for determining teacher effectiveness. The nominated teachers were observed in their classrooms in order to establish that their practices were consistent with past research findings that have identified characteristics of highly effective literacy teachers. So I created an evaluation guide containing a list of those common principles identified in recent scholarship that characterize highly effective teachers of literacy. I conducted a full-day observation in each of the nominated teachers' classrooms and noted on the evaluation guides evidence of the teachers exhibiting those characteristics. 8 teacher participants displayed the behaviors in their classrooms that fully corresponded to this list, so they continued on as participants in the data collection portion. And then in my information gathering, I collected data typical of a qualitative study. I conducted semi-structured face-to-face interviews with each teacher on 2 separate occasions. I conducted an interview with 3 students in each classroom. I performed full-day observations on 4 occasions in each classroom. I administered a written survey, and I collected selected artifacts from each classroom. In each form of data collection and in the follow-up data analysis, my goal was to advance my understanding of these teachers' perspectives regarding independent reading and how this translated into their classroom independent reading practice.
It was really an impressive and in-depth methodology explanation, which really helps people understand that qualitative research is as rigorous as quantitative, and that's why I really appreciated and wanted to ask you about that section.
I agree. I think it does.
What were your findings then, after you did this in-depth work, in relation to the effective teachers' actual independent reading practices in comparison to the traditional notions that you already brought up about unguided, sustained silent reading?
Well, of course, each teacher participant in this study utilized independent reading somewhat differently than the others. However, there were numerous commonalities that became apparent during my analysis of the data, and led to the overarching conclusion that these teachers held the dual objective of enabling their students' independence, but under the careful guidance of expert adults. For example, the teachers demonstrated some shared beliefs about the elements contained in classroom independent reading, including opportunities for students to be given choices in a variety of areas, to work at their own levels, and to interact with text without depending on adults to solve their problems. These components seem consistent with a conventional understanding of independent reading. However, the teachers were also united in their belief about the necessity of adult support for student efforts. So while all of the teachers agreed that independent reading was an opportunity for young readers to test their wings, they felt responsible for providing ongoing assistance in areas like monitoring the student choices, teaching those independent reading behaviors, and maintaining a focus on student growth. The evidence from this study demonstrated that independent reading, as conducted by these teachers, was a learning endeavor, with many elements enacted specifically for their instructional possibilities. That is far removed from the model known as sustained silent reading, or SSR, where the objective was simply to encourage reading enjoyment and avoid any methods of accountability. The troubling aspect of this disconnect for literacy policy is that the National Reading Panel report, which has wielded enormous influence over scores of literacy decisions in the more than a decade since its release, has called into the question the credibility of all classroom uses of independent reading. While it is unknown to what extent practices of other teachers share the components of SSR, it is clear that the highly effective teachers in this study conduct independent reading in ways that differ significantly from traditional SSR programs on which the National Reading Panel conclusions were based.
Could you discuss your conclusions related to teachers focusing on student growth and student-based programs? Because it seems like your conclusions really had a lot of implications for practice.
I think so. I think there are really three important practical outcomes from these teachers' practices that might support student growth through independent reading. First, my work with these teachers demonstrates that the independent component of independent reading is actually a developmental process that occurs most beneficially under the guidance of expert adults. In fact, it may have been this lack of guidance and oversight in some independent reading practices, especially with the youngest readers, that caused their effectiveness to be questioned. So enacting reading activities that privilege opportunities for student independence while continuing to be embedded with teacher support allowed these teachers to use independent reading with greater confidence in its ability to prompt student progress. Second, in this era in which teachers feel pressured to ensure that every classroom event is purposeful, these teachers' focus on learning outcomes allowed independent reading to take its place as a valuable component of their literacy programs rather than as an add-on. They believe that inserting intentional opportunities for reading instruction and holding students accountable for the learning that ensues allows independent reading to hold increased possibilities for influencing their students' reading growth. And finally, these teacher participants adapted their independent reading practices to meet the needs of their students. The label independent might prompt in others a strict interpretation that requires reading to occur in a silent or solitary manner. But these teachers chose to design independent reading activities that accommodated their young students' needs to explore text in ways that defy a more literal construction, including allowing for oral reading or peer interactions when those actions benefited the reading experience.
Well, thank you so much. I really learned a lot from your article about intentionality of these activities makes such a big difference. And I'm sure today's conversation will encourage others to read your article. You have many more details that people could read, and we only could cover the surface. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Tricia.
The full citation is Sanden, 2012, Independent Reading, Perspectives and Practices of Highly Effective Teachers. The Reading Teacher, Volume 66, Number 3, pages 222 to 231. The citation can also be found on the College of Ed podcast website. Thank you, and join us for future research breaks.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.